Okay, so are we ready to dive in? Today, we are tackling Governing the Commons by Eleanor Ostrom. And let me tell you, this book, it feels more relevant now than ever, especially when we're talking about finding solutions for managing those resources we all share, right? Ones that go beyond just like every man for themselves or, handing all the power to like some big authority figure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's really fascinating to me about Ostrom's work is how she steps outside those usual theories, those boxed in ideas. She went all over, like literally traveled the world studying real communities
Yeah.
who depend on shared things, like pastures, forests, even irrigation systems.
Mm.
And these places, they're facing that whole tragedy of the commons thing head on. But here's the kicker. Many of them, they figured out how to make it work, how to thrive for like generations.
What's really fascinating about Ostrom's work is that, she went beyond the usual theories. She actually traveled the world studying real communities who depend on these shared resources. Things like pastures, forests, even irrigation systems. These are all places that are facing this tragedy of the commons head on. And yet so many of them have found ways to thrive, often for generations.
It's funny, that phrase tragedy of the commons, it's catchy, it sticks with you, but it also feels kind of, well, tragic. Like we're all doomed to just destroy everything we share.
Yeah.
Ostrom, she really challenges that, doesn't she?
Absolutely. She does. The classic example is that pasture, right?
Yeah.
Everyone wants to graze as many animals as possible because that's in their best interest. But of course, what happens is if they all actually do that, the land gets destroyed and then nobody benefits in the long run.
Right, right.
And Ostrom actually uses the prisoner's dilemma from game theory to illustrate this.
Oh, yeah, the prisoner's dilemma. I vaguely remember that from college. Can you, give us a quick refresher?
Yeah, so imagine two suspects, right? They're being interrogated and they can't communicate with each other. So they each have a choice. They can either betray the other person and confess, or they can stay silent.
Hmm.
Now, if they both stay silent, they both get a lighter sentence.
Okay.
But here's the thing. If one person betrays the other and confesses, while the other stays silent, the betrayer gets to go free, and the one who stayed silent gets hit with a much harsher punishment.
Oh, so then they both end up betraying each other because they just assume the worst, even though they'd be way better off cooperating.
Exactly. And that's exactly what Ostrom highlights. Because without any sort of trust or a system in place, people acting rationally in their own self-interest, it can actually create a complete disaster for everyone.
It's like she's saying, hey, this whole tragedy, it's not inevitable. We're not, destined to fail here.
Yeah.
We just need to, find smarter ways to work together.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
And that's where those real world examples come in, right? Because she didn't just focus on the failures. I mean, she found all these communities that were managing their shared resources successfully, and some of them for centuries.
Right. She found so many cases where this was actually working. Take, for instance, those Swiss pastures that she studied. They have this system for managing their grazing land in a way that's sustainable. They have this thing called the wintering rule.
The wintering rule. Okay, tell me more.
Yeah, so basically the number of cows you can graze up in the pastures during the summer is directly tied to how many cows you can feed during the winter when they're down in the valleys.
Wait, say that one more time. I feel like that's genius or something. How does tying the number of cows you can graze in the summer to how many you can feed in the winter, how does that even work?
So what it does is it brilliantly links the right to use a shared resource,
Yeah.
those lush summer pastures up in the Alps, to the responsibility of caring for your animals year-round.
Oh, okay.
Because you can't just send a ton of cows up there in the summer just because you want to, take advantage. You have to think long-term. And the system, you wouldn't believe it, it's worked for them for centuries.
Centuries. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, that one goes straight into the surprising solutions file. So it's not just about having rules, it's about having rules that actually connect to the needs of the community,
Exactly.
and their reality. Did she find this kind of smart thinking anywhere else?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's jump from the Swiss Alps to the mountains of Japan.
Okay.
They've been managing their forests for timber for, ages. And they have these incredibly detailed rules about what you can harvest, when you can harvest it, even how you can harvest it. They have rules for everything, down to the size of the trees, the tools you can use. It's very specific.
That's so interesting. It sounds almost like ceremonial, Like
Yeah.
they've developed this deep respect for the forest itself.
And that respect is what translates into these very practical rules,
Yeah.
that end up ensuring the long-term health of the forest. It's not just about maximizing how much timber you can extract. It's about actually being a steward of that forest for the long term.
Okay, I think I'm seeing a theme here. We've got two totally different parts of the world, two totally different resources, but they both show communities taking charge, right?
Exactly.
It's not about just following orders from some distant government or anything. They're making their own rules.
Exactly. Ostrom calls this self-governance. And it's a key element in all the successful cases that she studied. Because these communities, they're not just passively following some rules that somebody else handed down. They're actively involved in creating those rules, monitoring those rules, and enforcing those rules.
Right.
It's a system that actually works for them.
And it can't always be smooth sailing. Are those
It's not.
even in the most tight-knit communities, you're going to have some disagreements, people trying to bend the rules a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. And Ostrom acknowledges that completely. What she found was that those systems that are most successful have built-in mechanisms for resolving disputes
Okay.
and for adapting to new conditions, right? Because the world is constantly changing. So remember those water courts in the Philippines we talked about earlier?
Yes.
That's a great example. That's a mechanism for dealing with those disputes fairly and transparently.
And she found that in other places too, right? Didn't she talk about Spanish irrigation systems too?
Yeah. There were similar systems in Spain that had been operating for, an incredibly long time as well.
So it's like they created a whole system of water governance that was tailor-made for their needs.
Exactly.
Their specific context. That's remarkable.
And it really highlights that you don't always need some kind of top-down authority to manage these shared resources. Sometimes the best solutions, the most innovative, the ones that actually last, they come from the ground up, from the people who are most directly affected by how those resources are managed.
This is also fascinating. So we've seen how important that self-governance is, that local knowledge. But did she find any other common threads? Are there specific principles we can point to and say, okay, these seem to be key to making this whole thing work?
That's where her research gets really, really interesting. She identified 8 design principles that she found were consistently present in these successful systems. Now, it's important to remember that these aren't meant to be hard and fast rules. They're more like guidelines or signposts, to point you in the right direction. So those design principles, the first one, it's pretty intuitive, actually. Clearly defined boundaries. You need to know who's part of this group that's managing the resource and exactly what it is they're managing.
Yeah, that makes sense. With those Swiss pastures, it's not just anyone who can wander up there with the herd of cows. You have to be part of that community.
Right.
And you have to buy into their system, play by their rules.
Exactly. And then there's also rules about how you participate in monitoring the resource.
Yep.
So who's keeping an eye on things? How do you know if someone's, bending the rules, trying to get away with something?
Yeah.
And what are the consequences if they do?
It's like having a neighborhood watch, but for your local forest or the fishing grounds. And it makes sense, right? The people who depend on something are going to be the most invested in protecting it.
Exactly. And Ostrom, she also found that successful systems, they have ways to resolve conflicts. Remember those water courts in the Philippines?
Yeah.
Such a great example of a built-in mechanism for dealing with those disputes and doing it fairly transparently so everyone knows what's going on.
And she found this kind of thing in other places too, right? Those Spanish water courts, I think those had a whole system for settling arguments over water rights too.
Absolutely, yeah. And that kind of leads us to another one of the principles, having a system of what she called graduated sanctions. So it's not always about, immediately hitting someone with the harshest punishment if they break a rule. Sometimes a warning is enough, or a small fine, to kind of nudge them back in the right direction.
So it's about being fair and proportional, which over time probably helps build trust in the system overall, right?
That's right.
Because if people feel like they're being listened to, treated fairly, they're more likely to be on board with the whole thing.
Exactly. Ostrom found that these systems work best when they recognize that people aren't perfect, everyone makes mistakes, and there are ways to address those mistakes without resorting to, extreme measures right away.
That's actually really refreshing to hear because so many systems that we see, in the world today, they just seem designed to catch people out, punish them, which just creates this whole atmosphere of fear and distrust.
Right.
It's like Ostrom saying, hey, we can actually do better than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And she backs it up with real-world examples. She also emphasizes how important it is to recognize the rights of those local communities to actually govern their own resources.
Okay.
And this is where things can get, a little tricky,
Yeah.
especially when you have, external actors,
Right.
governments, corporations coming in, sometimes with their own agendas about how things should be run.
So is this where that whole idea of polycentric governance comes in?
Yeah.
Because she's not saying that, like, larger scale governance is automatically bad, right? Just that it needs to, like, work in conjunction with those local systems.
Exactly. That is the heart of it. What she argued for was a more nuanced approach, right? Where governance is actually distributed across those multiple levels.
Okay.
So you have the local community, but then you might also have regional bodies, national bodies.
Right.
Each level has a role to play, but it's about finding the right balance, making sure that power and responsibility are distributed in a way that makes sense for that particular context.
So it's kind of like checks and balances, but for, like, how we manage our resources. You've got those local communities, they know their backyard better than anyone.
Right.
But you also have those higher levels of governance, and maybe they can step in and provide support, oversight, make sure everyone's on the same page.
That's a great analogy.
Mhm.
And it's not just about government either. Ostrom, she also talked about how important it is to have non-governmental organizations, those NGOs, community groups, sometimes even the private sector, playing a role. Because these are complex issues. And the best solutions, they often come from bringing all those different voices to the table.
It's about acknowledging that there isn't going to be one simple answer, right?
Right.
Like, we can't just, wave a magic wand and fix everything with a single policy or whatever. Okay, so I've got these 8 principles, which, honestly, that's already a lot to take in. But then Ostrom also emphasized something else that I think is really, really interesting, and that's the importance of what she called social capital. So break that down for us. What did she actually mean by that?
She's talking about all those kind of intangible things that hold communities together. Things like trust,
Okay.
reciprocity, that sense of I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, shared norms, having a collective identity, feeling like you're part of something larger than yourself. And these things, they might seem kind of fuzzy, hard to define, but they're actually crucial for making any system work. Because if you don't trust your neighbors, if you don't trust the people who are supposed to be managing those resources, the whole thing falls apart.
It's like trying to run a business where nobody trusts each other. It's just not going to work.
Exactly. And building that trust, it takes time. It takes open communication, a willingness to actually work through disagreements, recognizing that you're all in this together.
So it's not just about having the right rules written down somewhere. It's about fostering the right kind of social fabric, that sense of community.
I love that. Now, all of this is incredibly insightful, but I'm wondering, some listeners might be thinking, okay, this is all well and good for those small communities that Ostrom studied, but what about the massive problems we're facing today, right? Climate change, global inequality, dwindling resources, these things feel so much bigger than a local pasture or irrigation system.
Absolutely. And Ostrom acknowledged that.
Right.
Scaling up these solutions, it's one of the biggest challenges we face. But her work, it's not meant to be like a blueprint that you just slap onto any situation.
Right.
It's more like a toolkit.
It's a different way of thinking about these challenges and maybe a good set of principles that we can apply, in a bunch of different contexts. Exactly. And just because something worked in one place doesn't mean it'll automatically work somewhere else, right?
Right.
We have to be really mindful of the culture, the social dynamics, even the ecology of a place. But those underlying principles, that self-governance, local knowledge, clearly defined rules, those are relevant across scales.
I'm also curious about something else. We've been talking about a lot of success stories. What about the failures? Did Ostrom ever study cases where things just, like, fell apart?
Oh, absolutely.
And what can we learn from those? So we've really dug deep into this, haven't we? Into Eleanor Ostrom's Governing the Commons, this idea of how we manage what we all share. And I think one of the most powerful takeaways here is that it's not just about some, abstract theory. This is about the real world, right? This is about those actual resources that we all depend on every single day.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about those forests, those fisheries, those irrigation systems, those things that, often we take for granted, but they're essential for our survival.
And it's easy to get overwhelmed, I think, especially when we're thinking about, the scale of these global challenges that we're facing. Climate change, pollution, right? It's like, what can I, little old me, actually do about any of this?
Right. You feel powerless.
Yeah, exactly. But Ostrom, she gives us this, this sense of hope, this sense of agency, because she reminds us that collective action, it always starts with those individual choices that we make. And all those little choices, they add up over time.
And I love that she uses all those examples of those communities that have actually been successful because it shows that it's possible, right? It's not just some pie in the sky idea.
Right. There are real people in the real world who are making this work.
Exactly. And they're not doing anything, magical. They're just finding ways to come together, to cooperate, to govern those resources in a way that's sustainable over the long term.
So if I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, okay, that's great, but where do I even begin? What would you say? Like, what's a good first step for someone who wants to, put these ideas into action?
Well, I think a good place to start is to just look around your own community.
Okay.
Think about those shared resources that are important to you,
Yeah.
that you interact with on a daily basis. Maybe it's a local park, you know, the
Yeah.
community garden, or even just, the air that you breathe, the water that you drink.
Hmm.
And ask yourself, how are these resources being managed?
I love that you said the park because that's something we all use, we all love, but we probably don't think about it too much. It's just
Yeah.
like there, right.
Right? It's just there. But if you start paying attention, you might notice things,
Hmm.
Are there clear rules about how people can use the park? Who's responsible for making sure that it stays clean and safe? Are there ways for people in the community to voice their concerns or, you know, get involved in the decision-making process? And if the answers you find aren't so great, don't just throw your hands up and say, well, that's just the way it is.
Right. You're not
Like,
powerless.
exactly. Ostrom's work, it gives you the tools to actually do something about it. You can get involved, advocate for change. You can even organize your own community around some of these issues, and you can apply this same kind of thinking to larger scale challenges too. So if you're worried about climate change, for example, support organizations that are working on solutions. Make choices in your own life to reduce your own carbon footprint.
Right. Like vote.
Yes, exactly. Vote. Let your elected officials know that you care about these issues and that you expect them to do something about it.
It's all about like reclaiming that sense of agency, right? Like we're not just along for the ride. We can actually steer the ship a little bit.
Exactly. Remember, the future isn't something that's just going to happen to us. It's something that we are all creating together through our actions, our choices, and our voices.
And Ostrom's Governing the Commons, it gives us this incredible toolkit, this framework for making sure that we create a future where both people and the planet can thrive,
Yeah.
That we find ways to share these precious resources in a way that's equitable and sustainable for generations to come.
Well said.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful, inspiring, and maybe even a little bit challenging. Remember, the future of our commons is in our hands, and the time to act is now.